Margaret had always thought of herself as an ordinary woman, someone who had lived through the ups and downs of life, a widow, a mother, and now a grandmother. At 72, she wasn't looking for anything extraordinary, just a chance to improve her health and meet some new people. So when she signed up for the senior fitness class at the local community center, she expected gentle stretching, a bit of walking, maybe some light weights to ease her stiff joints. Nothing more. The gym, however, was not what Margaret had anticipated. Dr. Lance, the class instructor, was younger than she had expected, with a square jaw and an almost unnerving energy that didn't match his silver-streaked hair. His smile was dazzling, and his eyes gleamed with a strange intensity. He greeted them with the charisma of a showman, immediately putting everyone at ease. "All right, everyone, let's get those muscles awake," he said, clapping his hands in an exaggerated motion. He motioned to a row of treadmills, some stretching mats, and a few machines, all gleaming under the harsh lights. "We're here to awaken our vitality, one step at a time." Margaret nodded, feeling the warmth of his enthusiasm, but also a creeping sense that something wasn't quite right. She was used to seeing people like Dr. Lance, youthful, confident, but there was something about the way he looked at them, almost as though they were merely part of a test, a trial for something he had planned. Then there was Harold. She had known Harold for years. He was a fellow widow from the neighborhood, someone who always seemed a few steps behind in life, particularly since his arthritis had begun to flare up. He had trouble walking without a cane and had complained endlessly about his stiff joints. He was a slow, deliberate man, with a perpetual limp. But when the class started their first warm-up jog around the track, Harold didn't slow down. In fact, he accelerated. At first, Margaret thought she was imagining things. But there he was, Harold, running and not just jogging, sprinting like a man half his age. His face was flushed, but there was a glimmer of joy in his eyes, a newfound energy she hadn't seen in years. "Harold, are you all right?" Margaret called out, her voice full of disbelief. Harold didn't answer. He was too far ahead. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she quickened her pace to catch up. But something strange happened. It wasn't just Harold. The others, too, Beryl, Ethel, even Arthur, a man with a history of knee problems, began moving faster than they ever had. Beryl leapt over a hurdle with the grace of a much younger woman. Ethel effortlessly vaulted a barrier, and Arthur was outpacing everyone, laughing. They were all moving like athletes, like people decades younger than their true age. Dr. Lance stood in the middle of the gym, watching them, a pleased smile tugging at his lips. "Excellent," he called out, as though they had just completed an impossible feat. "This is just the beginning. Our bodies are full of untapped power. This is simply the reawakening of what you already have inside." Margaret's heart raced, but it wasn't from exertion. No, it was the realization that something was off. How could they all improve so quickly? It was as if their bodies had been altered, reshaped in an instant. She glanced at Edna, her best friend of over 40 years, who had slowed to a walk beside her. Edna's face mirrored her own confusion, brows furrowed in suspicion. "I don't trust this, Margaret," Edna muttered under her breath. "This is more than just a fitness class." Margaret nodded. She could feel it, too. The air in the gym was thick with something, an unnatural energy that seemed to pulse through the room. Dr. Lance's voice rang out again, smoother this time, as he congratulated the group. "Remember, this is just the beginning, my friends. We're tapping into a strength that's been dormant for far too long." As the class ended and the seniors gathered to stretch, Margaret's mind raced. How could Harold, of all people, be moving like that? And why were the others so energized? There was a darkness beneath the surface of all this, something no one was saying. Edna turned to her, whispering, "We're not just here for exercise, are we?" Margaret's gut tightened. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but it was a truth neither of them wanted to confront. As they left the gym, Margaret glanced over her shoulder at Dr. Lance, who was talking to a few of the others. His smile remained, but his eyes seemed to linger on them for a fraction too long. The uneasy feeling lingered as they stepped out into the fading sunlight. Something was happening here, something more than fitness, and Margaret was determined to find out what. The next few days felt unsettlingly surreal to Margaret. Each time she walked into the gym, she could feel the electric buzz of something unnatural in the air, like the hum of a secret waiting to be uncovered. Harold was sprinting even faster now, and the others, Beryl, Ethel, Arthur, were all moving with an energy that defied logic. Their transformation was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Margaret tried to stay focused on her workouts, but her mind constantly drifted back to that moment when Harold had run like a track star. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And it wasn't just the sudden surge of strength. It was Dr. Lance's unsettling calm, the way he seemed almost too pleased with the class's progress, as though this was all part of a well-rehearsed plan. That night, after the class, Margaret sat in her dimly lit living room, deep in thought. She hadn't shared her suspicions with anyone except Edna, who, to her surprise, had been just as concerned. They had both noticed how Dr. Lance's eyes seemed to linger on certain members of the class, almost as though he were watching a performance unfold rather than leading a fitness session. "Margaret," Edna had whispered earlier, "he's not just a fitness instructor, there's something more going on here." And Margaret had to agree. She knew there was more to the story than a simple fitness class. But what could it be? And why was Harold, of all people, responding this way? That evening, when the streets were quiet and the gym's lights flickered in the distance, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't just stand by and hope the mystery would unravel on its own. She needed answers. And she knew where to start. The gym was eerily silent after hours, the only sound the soft buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Margaret had never stayed past class time before, but tonight she had a feeling she couldn't ignore. With Edna by her side, she snuck into the back entrance, avoiding the security guard who always lingered by the front desk. "Are you sure about this?" Edna whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What if we get caught?" Margaret squeezed her hand. "We need to know the truth, Edna. If there's something wrong here, we can't let it go on. We're not getting any younger, but we're not stupid either." They made their way down a narrow hallway toward the back of the gym, where Margaret had once noticed a door that was always locked. Tonight, however, it was slightly ajar. Her heart raced as they approached, the creak of the door making Edna flinch. "This is it," Margaret murmured, pushing the door open. The room was dark, save for the eerie green glow emanating from several machines scattered across the floor. Sight hit Margaret like a punch in the gut. It wasn't a typical gym storage room. It was a lab, high-tech, hidden from the world. Rows of shelves lined the walls, filled with strange vials of glowing liquids and jars of what looked like organs. Her stomach churned. In the center of the room stood a long table, cluttered with research files, diagrams, and photos pinned to the walls. But it was the photographs that caught Margaret's attention. The faces of past gym members, people she recognized from the classes, were displayed like trophies, their names written beneath the images. But as Margaret stepped closer, she realized something far darker. Many of these people were listed as missing. Each name was followed by a date, most of them recent. "Do you see this?" Edna's voice was a whisper of disbelief. "They've vanished without a trace." Margaret grabbed one of the files off the table. It was thick with research papers, some of them yellowed with age. She flipped through them, heart racing as she read the words. Subject number 14, Serum Trial X2345. Phase 1, Immediate Enhancement of Physical Agility. Subject lost to Phase 2. Her hands trembled as she continued reading, the horrifying realization settling in. The serum they were testing on these seniors wasn't just some quick fix for muscle strain. It was a dangerous experiment. The files were filled with references to a World War II serum, something that had been developed decades ago, and it seemed to be the key to restoring youth, vitality, and physical prowess. But the side effects were fatal for some. And then she found it. Her name. Subject number 28, Margaret Lewis. Expected physical enhancement, 300% increase in strength. Her blood ran cold as she scanned the rest of the file. The last line sent a chill down her spine. Subject number 28. Disappearance. Unknown. Margaret, this is insane. Edna's voice was barely audible, barely a whisper in the room filled with terror. Just as Margaret was about to turn to Edna, a soft clicking noise broke the silence. She froze. The door slammed shut behind them. Dr. Lance stepped into the room, his calm demeanor belying the sinister edge in his eyes. "I see you've discovered my little project," he said, his voice smooth and effortless, as though they were simply discussing the weather. "I was wondering when you'd start digging." Margaret took a step back, her heart pounding. You've been experimenting on us, all of us." Dr. Lance smiled, his teeth gleaming. "Not experimenting, Margaret. Restoring what was lost. You've all been given a gift, a second chance. And now you have a choice. Embrace it fully or leave. But know this, some of you might never make it out alive." Margaret's blood ran cold as Dr. Lance's smile grew wider, the gleam in his eyes darker than before. She had walked into a nightmare, and now there was no way out. Margaret's mind raced, struggling to process the weight of Dr. Lance's words. The air around her felt thick with tension, the room suddenly stifling despite the cool, sterile glow of the lab equipment. Edna stood frozen beside her, her hands shaking with fear. Dr. Lance, however, appeared unnervingly calm, almost as if this was a moment he had prepared for. "You knew this whole time," Margaret said, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "You've been drugging us, turning us into—" "What? Experiments?" Dr. Lance smiled, his gaze never leaving Margaret's face. "Drugging. Number restoring. You see, the serum you've been taking was developed during World War II, a formula designed to enhance human potential, muscular strength, agility, and most importantly, longevity." He paused, watching them closely. "What you're experiencing is the rebirth of your youth. Not just strength, but the ability to reclaim what time has taken from you." Edna opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Margaret, however, found her voice. "And what happens to the ones who don't adapt?" She gestured to the disappearing faces on the wall, to the files with missing names. Dr. Lance's smile faded, and for a brief moment his eyes flickered with something darker, something far more dangerous. "Some of you will be lucky," he said softly. "The serum amplifies the body's natural resilience, but it's still in its early stages. The risks are high. Some might disappear, some might become too strong to control." Margaret felt a chill creep down her spine as she pieced together the horrifying reality. "What are you really doing, Lance?" she asked, her voice a little firmer now, trying to muster some strength in the face of the terror that was slowly closing in on them. "I'm offering you immortality," he said, his tone almost seductive. "A second life, but at a cost. You see, this isn't just about physical strength. It's about survival. The serum enhances your body, yes, but it also manipulates your DNA. Some of you will become better versions of yourselves, more powerful, more vibrant. But others," he trailed off, his eyes flickering with a cruel gleam. "Others might not make it. They might lose themselves completely." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. "You're playing God," she whispered. Dr. Lance's smile returned, though it now carried an edge of amusement. "Perhaps, but think of the possibilities, Margaret. You could be young again, strong, healthy, and powerful. No more pain, no more frailty. You would have the life you've always dreamed of, you and everyone else in this class." Edna stepped forward, her voice shaking but defiant. "And what if we don't want your serum? What if we don't want to become part of your experiment?" Lance's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "Then you can leave. But know this, if you stop taking the serum, you'll experience withdrawal, and the effects aren't pretty. It could be a slow death, Edna, a loss of everything you've gained." He let the words hang in the air, their weight sinking in. Margaret felt a knot form in her stomach. The thought of going back to her old life, weak, fragile, dependent, was unbearable. She had already felt the change, the strength pulsing through her muscles, the fire of youth reawakening in her veins. She could run faster, jump higher, even think clearer than before. How could she just throw all of that away? But then, there was the dark side of it all, the people who had vanished. Harold, who had been the first to exhibit unnatural strength, was nowhere to be found, and the others in the class, the ones who had shown such promise, were now whispers in the wind. They were being consumed by this dangerous experiment. Margaret felt herself faltering, torn between the alluring promise of eternal strength and the unsettling reality of the cost. Lance continued, his voice soft, coaxing, as if speaking to a child. Think about it, Margaret. You could live without pain. You could outlive your peers, and those who resist. They'll only grow weaker as time takes its toll, while you remain forever in your prime. Is that what you want, Margaret? Edna asked, her voice firm now. To be part of this twisted game? Margaret swallowed hard. She wanted to believe there was another way out of this nightmare, but the offer was so tempting. To be young again, to feel strong, to finally be free of the aching joints and fragile bones that had defined her old age. It was a dream she couldn't ignore. Dr. Lance was watching her closely, his smile widening as if he could already see her decision forming in her eyes. I'll give you some time to think it over. But remember, Margaret, this opportunity won't wait forever. The longer you hesitate, the harder it will be to go back. With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Margaret and Edna alone in the cold, fluorescent-lit lab. The door clicked shut behind him, and Margaret stood frozen, her mind racing. The decision ahead of her felt impossible. Stay and embrace the power, or leave and risk losing everything, including her life. But deep down, Margaret knew the truth. This wasn't just about youth. It was about survival. If she left, there was a chance she might never get another shot at strength like this. But if she stayed, there was no turning back. And then there was the ultimate question. Was she willing to sacrifice her humanity for immortality? The silence that followed Dr. Lance's departure was suffocating. Margaret stood still for what felt like an eternity, her mind spinning with the impossible choice before her. The formula, the promise of eternal youth, it all seemed so enticing. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more the weight of the decision pressed down on her chest. She wasn't just considering her future. She was beginning to realize that the lives of everyone in the class might be hanging in the balance. Edna's voice broke the silence, her words trembling but determined. We can't just let him get away with this. We have to expose him. We have to get out of here before it's too late. Margaret turned to face her best friend, her heart heavy with the gravity of the situation. Edna's face was pale, the lines of worry deepening as she spoke. Margaret could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there, too. Resolve. Edna wasn't going to be fooled by Dr. Lance's charming demeanor. She wasn't going to let herself become part of his twisted experiment. We need proof, Edna, Margaret said softly, her voice still shaken. We need to get into the system, into the files. We need to know everything about this serum, about the people who've disappeared, and— She hesitated, swallowing the lump in her throat. We need to know what happened to Harold. Edna nodded, the fire returning to her eyes. And I think I know how we can get it. The next day, when the class was in full swing, Edna, Margaret, and a few others slipped away unnoticed. With Edna's help, they met up with Margaret's grandson, Aaron. A sharp-witted young man with a knack for hacking, Aaron had always been the one Margaret turned to whenever she needed to understand the strange and complex world of technology. Right now, they needed him more than ever. The gym was deserted, the dull hum of fluorescent lights the only sound in the empty hallway as Aaron tapped away on his laptop. The others kept watch, anxiety growing in the air. Margaret paced the floor, trying to calm her nerves, but each passing second felt like a step closer to disaster. She could sense that Dr. Lance was getting closer to discovering their plan. Could almost feel his eyes on them, even though he wasn't around. Aaron's fingers flew across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. I'm in, he said with a satisfied grin. I've got access to the gym's security files, the internal network, and Dr. Lance's personal database. Let's see what he's hiding. As the screen loaded, Margaret's heart raced. The information appeared one file at a time. Class schedules, attendance sheets, and something else. Surveillance footage. Slowly, the images began to shift, showing seniors coming and going, the usual harmless activities they'd seen over the past weeks. But then, something strange appeared. One of the videos showed a meeting between Dr. Lance and a well-dressed man, his face obscured by shadows. In another, a class participant, an elderly woman, was seen collapsing after her session. She was quickly removed by two men in lab coats, but her face had a strange, unnatural stillness to it. Margaret felt a chill crawl down her spine. "What's going on here?" Edna whispered, looking at the screen, her face growing pale. Aaron clicked through more files, each discovery more disturbing than the last. There were records of participants, and beside each name, a note. Missing. But more shocking still were the dates on the records. They were all recent. The disappearances weren't just a part of some ancient experiment. They were happening now. And Harold's name appeared too, listed under Subject 43. His file was disturbingly bare, marked only with a single line of cryptic text. Test results inconclusive. Subject terminated. Margaret's hands trembled as she absorbed the information. Harold was gone. They had used him, just like the others. It wasn't a question of if they'd disappear, it was when. And then, the final revelation came. A hidden file, buried deep in the system, opened before them. It was a video recording, time-stamped to just 2 weeks ago. In the grainy footage, Dr. Lance appeared again, but this time his face was completely different. He looked older, much older. He was speaking to the camera, but his words weren't what shocked Margaret. It was his reflection in the glass, a reflection that didn't match his youthful appearance. Beneath the youthful skin, his true face was withered, as though the serum had kept him alive for far longer than it should have. "What the hell is going on?" Aaron said, his voice laced with disbelief. "This guy isn't just manipulating us. He's been manipulating himself for decades." Edna recoiled. "He's using the serum to stay alive. He's over 100 years old, but he's been hiding it." Margaret felt sick to her stomach. She had suspected something was wrong with Dr. Lance, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. He wasn't just a doctor running an experiment. He was a man who had been clinging to life by any means necessary, using anyone and everyone in his path to feed his obsession with immortality. But that wasn't all. The footage continued, and a new figure appeared in the frame. It was Edna, her face young, vibrant, and full of life. The timestamp on the file read, "Test Subject Approval, Day 1. Edna stared at the screen, horror dawning on her face. "That's me. I'm in the file." Margaret reached out and touched Edna's hand, trying to comfort her. "It's not too late, Edna. We can stop him. We have to." But as the reality of the situation sank in, Margaret realized that they were no longer just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for the truth against a man who had built an empire of lies and betrayals, all in the name of eternal youth. And if they couldn't stop him now, they might very well become his next victims. The walls of the gym seemed to close in around them, the weight of the conspiracy bearing down like a dark cloud. Margaret and Edna exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about exposing the truth, no matter the cost. The hours following their discovery were a blur of frantic planning and rising tension. Margaret could hardly believe what they had uncovered. Edna, still in shock from the revelation of her own involvement in Dr. Lance's twisted scheme, remained silent as they gathered in the dimly lit back room of the gym. Aaron's laptop sat open in front of them. The evidence of Dr. Lance's century-long manipulation spread across the screen. There was no turning back now. "We have to leave," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here before Dr. Lance realizes what we know." Edna, her face pale but resolute, nodded. "But we can't just walk out the door. He'll be watching us." Aaron closed his laptop with a snap. "I'll loop the cameras. That'll give us about 15 minutes before he figures it out. But we'll need a way to get out of the building without being caught." Margaret's eyes darted across the room. The gym felt like a trap now, each corner holding the weight of everything they'd discovered. Her mind raced as she considered their options. The exit through the front would be too obvious. They would never make it past the surveillance system, but there had to be another way. "There's a service exit at the back," Margaret said, her memory flashing back to her first day at the gym when Dr. Lance had given her the tour. "It's hidden behind a storage closet in the east wing. We can slip out that way." Aaron nodded. "Good idea. I'll disable the security system for a few minutes to cover our tracks. But we need to move quickly." The tension was suffocating as they prepared for their escape. Each footstep felt heavier than the last, the fear of discovery closing in around them. With Edna in the lead, the group crept through the gym's hallways, avoiding the main areas where Dr. Lance or his assistants might be lurking. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, every creak of the floorboard sounding like a warning. When they reached the service exit, Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. They were so close, but Dr. Lance wasn't going to let them escape so easily. As they neared the door, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. It was Dr. Lance, his voice smooth and calm, carried through the walls. "You think you can run from me?" His words were laced with an eerie certainty, as though he had anticipated this moment all along. Margaret froze, her breath caught in her throat. She turned to Edna and whispered, "Go now." Before anyone could protest, Edna yanked open the service door, her muscles now effortlessly strong from the serum. Margaret followed closely behind, her pulse racing as they rushed into the narrow alley outside. But the moment they stepped into the open air, they saw the true extent of their problem. Dr. Lance and several of his enhanced seniors stood waiting for them, their expressions cold and unreadable. They had been tracking their every move, and now they were surrounded. The enhanced seniors were faster, more agile, like shadows in the dim light, moving with an inhuman grace. Margaret realized that they were no longer fighting just for their lives. They were fighting for the truth, and for the right to live without the shadow of the serum hanging over them. Dr. Lance's voice rang out once more, though this time there was an edge of anger to it. "You don't understand, Margaret. You can have everything you've ever dreamed of. Eternal youth, strength beyond measure. All you have to do is stay with me." Margaret squared her shoulders, her mind made up. The escape was no longer just about running. It was about reclaiming her agency, about taking back control of her own future. "I don't need your serum, Lance," she spat. "And I'm not the only one." At her signal, Aaron sprang into action, hacking into the gym's mainframe one final time. Within seconds, the security system flickered, causing the lights to flicker ominously. It was their chance. But as the seconds ticked away, Dr. Lance's enhanced seniors surged forward, their speed almost too fast to follow. Margaret was the first to react, her newfound strength surging through her veins. She leapt forward, her feet barely touching the ground as she bolted toward the alley. Edna and the others followed suit, running at a speed they never thought possible, but Dr. Lance was not one to let his creations slip away so easily. He gave chase, his enhanced body moving with predatory precision. The group dashed through the streets, each of them pushing their limits. The wind whipped through Margaret's hair as she raced ahead, heart hammering in her chest. She had never felt so alive, yet she was also painfully aware that this newfound power could be as much a curse as it was a blessing. In the distance, she saw an alleyway up ahead, a perfect escape route. But Dr. Lance was closing in, his footsteps echoing just behind them. Margaret could feel his presence, a malevolent force that seemed to push her forward, faster, harder. They reached the alley, but it wasn't enough. The enhanced seniors were too close, and Dr. Lance was right behind them. As they reached the alley's dead end, it felt like the end of the line. But Margaret wasn't about to let it end this way. Her mind raced as she scanned the alley for an exit, a fire escape. It was their only shot. "Up there!" she yelled, pointing to the ladder leading to the roof. Without thinking, she reached out and grabbed the rungs, her hands tightening around the metal. Edna followed, and the others scrambled after them. Dr. Lance's voice rang out in fury from below. "You can't outrun me forever." Margaret's heart raced as they climbed higher, but she knew they were running out of time. As they reached the top of the building, Margaret glanced over her shoulder. Dr. Lance had stopped at the base of the ladder, his eyes filled with venomous rage. In that moment, she realized the true cost of the serum, the power, the youth, the strength. None of it came without consequences. The pursuit for immortality had turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse, and Margaret had finally understood the most terrifying truth. No matter how fast they ran, the serum would always be one step ahead. But she was done running.